All women are different, but they are all women. This video is androcentric from a men's point of view and is presented as opinion, commentary, and debate. Expressing opinions is not violence. These are ideas to challenge, question, and argue in public, because classical liberalism relies on the First Amendment for its dialectic. If you are a feminist, then consider this. If patriarchy truly existed as claimed, feminism could not. And if all men are trash and women are equal to men, then what are we to conclude? Women will die for their children. Men will die for their wives and children. And God chose to die for all mankind. Authority rolls up with responsibility. If this framing of facts offends you, click off to a cute cat video. Proceeding further will expose you to gamma bias and criticism directed at ideas, claims, institutions, not at any individual's virtue or dignity. Our method follows the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And the transcendentals, the good, true, and beautiful. If this framework is not for you, feel free to exit now. It's no disgrace. Women are wonderful. God bless America. Men are great. Feminismus delendus est. Equality's Executioners, Feminist Jurisprudence and the Death of Due Process, written by Sophie Marie Eve Riker. Available now, links in description. Equality's Executioners. A field guide for men who still notice reality. The architecture of solipsism. Why the feminist demand for male presence is a Kafka trap that abolishes due process, and why the masculine veto is the ultimate cure for emotional tyranny. Read that article again, the one that weeps over the tragedy of a man pushing his chair back from the dinner table. Look closely at what it actually demands. It introduces a term, retreat privileging, which is nothing but a semantic weapon designed to outlaw male self-defense. Let us fix the grammar before we do anything else. To privilege means to grant an unearned advantage. But a man withdrawing his attention, his provision, and his time from a toxic, ungrateful, and endlessly complaining woman is not an unearned advantage. It is the exertion of a fundamental natural right. The writer is not asking for equality. She is demanding a hostage. She wants you chained to the chair, forced to absorb a barrage of neurotic grievances, disguised as relational labor, while the state stands behind you with a family court order to ensure you cannot leave. She calls your exit violence because she cannot tolerate the word no. Then comes the academic scam. She takes the pathologies of the modern feminine shadow, passive aggression, manipulative silences, and the absolute refusal to state a plain claim and rebrands them as sophisticated relational epistemology. It is a $10 phrase for throwing a tantrum and expecting daddy to guess what you want for breakfast. In the realm of logos, truth is objective, external, and verifiable. In the realm of the solipsistic void, truth is whatever her erratic emotional weather dictates in the moment, and your job is to read her mind. If you ask for clarity, just say what you mean. She frames it as an instrument of power. Why? Because clarity demands accountability. Clarity requires her to state her accusations plainly, which would give you the constitutional right of due process to defend yourself. She prefers the ambush. She operates a star chamber where you are guilty of structural violence if you stay, and guilty of retreat privileging if you go. It is the logic of the witch hunt, updated for the HR department. Let us look at the reality of that family meal she uses as her opening example. Why does the man push back from the table? He leaves because he has spent 12 hours building the civilization she complains about, paying the taxes that fund her administrative job, and carrying the existential burden of a household that will strip him of his children and his assets on a whim. He leaves because he is subjected to an ambush of weaponized hysteria, where his mere presence is treated as an original sin. His retreat is not an exercise of structural power, it is the exact opposite. It is the desperate, nonviolent veto of a rational man who realizes he is trapped at a poker game where the rules change every hand. The dealer is entirely irrational, and the chips are his life force. The male suicide rate, the paternity fraud rate, the 90% workplace death rate, these are the real architectures of absence. But the solipsist cannot see the millions of men who disappear into early graves. She can only see the empty chair that no longer worships her. Over the course of this deconstruction, we are going to systematically dismantle her entire thesis. We will expose her suspicion heuristic as pure projection, a psychological confession of how the diversity apparatus actually treats competent men. We will tear the mask of presence as the minimum and show it for what it truly is, a framework for male slavery. The hysterical plea to stay is the exposed throat of a system terrified of the consequences of its own cruelty. You have no moral obligation to sit at a table where you are served poison. Withholding the surplus of male competence from a society that calls your boundaries violence is not retreat. It is the beginning of Reconquista.
Bunkum article by a feminist, PhD. The Architecture of Absence, How Withdrawal Became the New Warfare. Presence is the minimum. You have seen it, the family meal where someone pushes back from the table. Not loudly, not dramatically, just gone. The fork placed down with surgical neutrality. The chair scraped back at precisely the angle that communicates I am not angry. I simply have nowhere further to be in this conversation with you. The body that was present becomes a monument to its own refusal. And the room fills with a silence so loud it has texture. That silence is not neutral. I am introducing a term into our collective vocabulary because we need one. Retreat privileging. It names what we have all witnessed, but lack the precision to indict. Retreat privileging is the structural, relational, and emotional capacity to withdraw from accountability, from the labor of being present to another person's reality, without that withdrawal itself being read as what it is, an exercise of power. We have been told endlessly by a culture built around the comfort of those who have always had the option to leave, that withdrawal is a neutral act, that stepping back is simply taking space. That silence is just silence. But consider, who gets to be silent without consequence? Who gets to leave the table, close the laptop, decline to respond, ghost a conversation, and have that absence interpreted as boundary setting rather than aggression? You already know the answer. You have always known it. The grammar of leaving. Consider videography, the ostensibly neutral art of framing and capturing reality. Whose camera decides when a scene ends? Whose editorial hand selects the cut? Whose gaze determines what is worth preserving and what may be permitted to disappear into the archive's silence? The documentarian who turns off the camera during a subject's moment of distress has made a choice. That choice is framed, always framed by the culture that produced it, as ethical restraint, as giving space, as not exploiting pain. And these may, in certain contexts, be defensible. But what of the documentarian who turns off the camera when the subject begins to articulate something that implicates the documentarian's own position? What of the cut that happens not to protect the filmed, but to protect the filmer from the discomfort of being present for what is being said? This is retreat privileging in its purest form, the power to determine when presence ends, framed always as neutrality or even generosity. In our media ecology, this grammar of leaving is omnipresent. The male book reviewer who engages with 300 pages of a woman's scholarly labor and then arriving at the chapter that most directly challenges his assumptions, summarizes it in a single neutral sentence before moving on. Has he engaged? Has he been present? Or has he performed the mechanics of attention while executing a precise surgical retreat from the moment that demanded his actual discomfort? He would say he was fair. He would point to the word count, the citations, the generosity of his attention. But the architecture of his review reveals what his prose conceals. He was present everywhere except where it cost him something. Indirect communication is not deficiency, it is survival. One of the most persistent and pernicious framings in our cultural discourse is the pathologization of how marginalized people, and women in particular, communicate. The entire diagnostic apparatus of indirectness, passive aggression, ambiguity, these are terms applied from the outside to communicative practices that were developed precisely because direct communication has historically been punished when it comes from the wrong body, the wrong position, the wrong side of the power differential. When a woman at a family meal says, "I'm fine, we can talk about it later," She is not being unclear. She is communicating with devastating precision. She is saying, I see that this room is not safe for what I need to say. I am tracking your capacity to receive it. I am doing the emotional labor of calibrating my speech to your readiness, a readiness you have done nothing to earn and everything to assume. This is not passive aggression. This is sophisticated relational epistemology. This is a form of knowledge production that privileges the relationship over the point, that understands truth as something that emerges between people, rather than something that can be fired like a weapon across a dinner table. And yet, the culture of retreat privileging reads this sophistication as deficiency. It says, just say what you mean. It says, I can't read your mind. These phrases, presented always as reasonable as requests for clarity, are themselves instruments of power. They function to transfer the burden of communication entirely onto the person who is already doing the invisible labor of calibrating, moderating, holding the relational field together. While the person making the request sits comfortably in the position of judge, I will evaluate your clarity. I will determine whether you have made yourself sufficiently legible to me. And if you have not, if your communication requires anything of me beyond passive reception, I am entitled to withdraw, entitled to push back from the table, entitled to close the laptop, entitled to treat the conversation as over because you weren't clear enough. Do you see how this works? The suspicion heuristic, achievement as evidence of extraction. Let us turn to the book review, that ostensibly civilized genre of cultural discourse. When a scholar from a marginalized position produces work of extraordinary scope and rigor, the reviewing apparatus activates what I call the suspicion heuristic, a reflexive, often unconscious pattern in which achievement itself becomes grounds for questioning. The review will acknowledge the work's quality, it must, or risk appearing obviously biased, but then will begin the subtle work of contextualizing that quality into something smaller than it is. She benefits from excellent institutional support. The field was ready for this intervention. The archive was particularly generous. Several scholars have been moving in this direction. Each of these phrases functions to redistribute credit away from the individual and toward a nebulous context, a context that, conveniently, no one needs to specify or be accountable for. The achievement is never quite her own. It is always situated, which, in the language of the privileged reviewer, means diminished, means we permit this work to exist, but we do not permit it to threaten our understanding of who produces knowledge and who merely receives it. And when the scholar in question responds, directly or indirectly, to this diminishment, when she points out the pattern, notes the consistency with which her work and the work of those like her is contextualized, while her privileged colleagues' work is celebrated, the retreat privileging apparatus activates immediately. The reviewer is hurt. The reviewer feels unfairly attacked. The reviewer perhaps even disengages from the public conversation entirely, citing the toxicity of the discourse, the impossibility of good faith engagement, the regrettable tendency of certain parties to make everything about identity, and the withdrawal, the retreat, is read as reasonable, as self-protective, as the only sane response to an unreasonable environment. While the woman who pointed out the pattern, she is read as causing the problem. Her speech, direct, this time unambiguous, backed by evidence, is recoded as aggression, as the reason the conversation can no longer continue. This is the loop. This is how it works. Achievement, suspicion, diminishment, objection, offense. At objection, withdrawal, recoding of withdrawal as reasonable, recoding of objection as cause of rupture. And the woman is left holding the bag. Look what you made me do. I was willing to engage until you made it impossible. Why disengagement is read as guilt, and why that reading is correct. We must now confront the most uncomfortable dimension of retreat privileging. The fact that disengagement is guilt, not always in the legal sense, not always in the sense of a specific transgression, but in the structural relational sense. The person who withdraws from the conversation about harm is the person who has calculated, consciously or not, that their interests are better served by absence than by presence. Consider the family meal again. the partner who pushes back from the table when the conversation turns to the division of household labor, the parent who leaves the room when their child begins to articulate a grievance, the colleague who has to take this call the moment the meeting turns to equity in promotion practices. In every case, the withdrawal communicates something, and what it communicates is not "I need space," but "I have assessed that my interests are better served by not being present for what is about to be said." It communicates, "I have something to protect, and I am protecting it by removing my body from the scene of accountability." This is why disengagement is read as guilt, because it is guilt. Not necessarily guilt for a specific act, though it may be that too, but guilt in the larger sense. The knowledge that one's position is indefensible if subjected to sustained, reciprocal, present scrutiny. The entire culture of retreat privileging exists to obscure this basic relational truth. It offers a vocabulary of self-care, of boundaries, of the right to disengage, all of which are real and necessary concepts, and all of which are weaponized by those who have the structural power to make their withdrawal consequential for others while remaining cost-free for themselves. A boundary is not a boundary when only one person gets to have one. A retreat is not self-care when the person retreating is the one whose presence is necessary for the repair of harm they participated in causing. The videographic proof. Return to the camera the documentary footage that exists, and the footage that does not. In every edited work, the cuts reveal the ideology of the editor. What we are shown and what we are not shown. Who gets to speak at length, and who is summarized, contextualized, cut away from. When I review video essays, media analyses, documentary footage produced within our current institutional frameworks, I see retreat privileging everywhere. I see the interview subject, typically a woman, typically a person of color, who begins to articulate something structurally incisive, and the cut that happens just before the articulation reaches its full force. I see the B-roll that fills the space where her full argument should be: nature shots, architectural details, the atmosphere, and I understand that the editor has made a decision about how much of her reality their audience can be asked to be present for. This is not neutral editing. This is retreat privileging at the level of the frame. The editor withdraws from the uncomfortable footage, not by deleting it, which would be conspicuous, but by surrounding it with enough beauty and distance that its force is absorbed into the aesthetic. The violence is not hidden. It is made beautiful, and the viewer is permitted to feel moved rather than implicated. Presence is the minimum. I am not asking for heroism. I am not asking for sacrifice. I am asking for the bare minimum, that those who have historically had the privilege of retreat, from conversations, from relationships, from accountability, from the labor of being present to realities that do not center them, begin to notice the architecture of their leaving. Notice when you push back from the table. Notice what was being discussed when you did. Notice who was speaking. Notice what they were asking of you, not in the content of their words, but in the direction of their relational labor. Notice whether they were asking you to be present, and notice whether your response was to leave. This is not an accusation. It is an invitation. It is the invitation that has been extended in 1,000 indirect and precise and sophisticated ways by every woman who ever said, "We can talk about it later," when she meant, "Please notice that I am protecting you from what I need to say, and please notice that this is labor I should not have to perform, and please, please, stay." Presence is the minimum, not presence as performance, not presence as the mechanics of sitting in a room while mentally composing your exit, but presence as a practice, as the sustained, uncomfortable, reciprocal labor of remaining in the relational field, even when that field demands something of you. The table is still set, the meal is still warm, the camera is still recording. Stay. The grammar of solipsism, deconstructing retreat privileging, and the myth of female sophisticated relational epistemology. You want to know what real absence looks like? Visit a courthouse on a Tuesday morning. Watch a man who has worked 14 years of overtime, who has coached Little League and paid the mortgage and never once raised his voice, hand his house keys to a magistrate because his wife decided she was unfulfilled. Watch him walk to his car with a garbage bag of clothes and a court order that reduces him to a weekend visitor in his own children's lives. That is absence. That is the architecture of a life dismantled. But the writer of this fashionable essay does not mean that absence. She means the absence she feels when a man stops listening to her complain about dishes. The term retreat privileging arrives preloaded with the intellectual dishonesty that characterizes our age. Let us perform what the ancients called diaresis, the division of a concept to reach its essence. Privilege, properly defined, denotes an unearned advantage systematically granted by social structures, a birthright one did not merit. When a man pushes back from a table where he is being berated, he exercises no unearned advantage. He exercises the most fundamental natural right recognized by every civilization from Aristotle's Polis to the framers of the Constitution, the right to free association and self-preservation. To pathologize a man's exit as structural violence is to assert ownership over his body, his attention, his very consciousness. It is the grammar of a slaveholder who calls the slave's flight theft. The writer has not identified a social injustice. She has identified a prisoner escape and called it a crime. Consider the opening scene, the family meal, the fork placed down, the chair scraped back. The writer paints this in funereal tones as though the man has committed an atrocity against the sacred domestic order. But apply the causal analysis that any honest philosopher would demand. Why does the man leave? He leaves because the meal has become an ambush. He has sat down expecting bread and fellowship and received instead an inquisition, a carefully staged tribunal where his failures, real and imagined, are to be prosecuted by an adversary who has been rehearsing her opening statement all afternoon. His retreat is not cowardice, it is triage. It is the rational withdrawal of a commander who recognizes that the battlefield has been mined and the rules of engagement guarantee his destruction regardless of what he says. The man who says nothing and leaves is not weaponizing silence. He is refusing to supply the rope for his own hanging. This writer attacks the phrase, "just say what you mean," as an instrument of power. Here we reach the dark heart of the matter, the precise point where feminist epistemology becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. Let me state this as a syllogism. Justice requires the clear articulation of charges. The accused must know what he has done to defend himself. She asserts that requiring clear articulation is itself an act of domination. Therefore, she asserts that justice itself is domination. Do you see the inversion? She demands the power to convict a man of a crime without ever stating the charges, without providing evidence, without permitting cross-examination. This is not sophisticated relational epistemology. This is the jurisprudence of the Star Chamber, the logic of the witchfinder who tells the accused, if you float, you are guilty. If you drown, you are innocent. There is no correct move except submission. Sophisticated relational epistemology. Let us examine this coinage with the etymological rigor that language deserves. Episteme means knowledge grounded in reason, justified true belief. She replaces reason with relationship and calls it sophistication. But what she has actually described is the ancient and well-documented practice of passive-aggressive manipulation. The refusal to state one's needs plainly, the expectation that another person will read one's mind, the punishment of that person for failing to perform the impossible. In every clinical manual ever written, this behavior is classified as a dysfunction. In the therapeutic state, it is celebrated as wisdom. Consider what she actually describes. A woman who says "I'm fine" when she is not fine, who expects her partner to decode the lie, and who considers him the aggressor when he takes her at her word. This is not communication. It is a trap disguised as a conversation, a minefield disguised as a living room. The masculine tradition of direct speech, the tradition of Socrates demanding definitions, of Thomas Aquinas stating objections before replies, of courtroom evidence presented openly for adversarial testing, exists precisely because civilization requires clarity to function. When a man says, "just say what you mean," he is not wielding power. He is offering the only grounds on which reconciliation becomes possible. He is saying, "give me something to work with." Name the injury so I can assess whether I caused it, whether I can repair it, whether your grievance is just. The author rejects this offer. She prefers the shadows, where grievances can multiply without audit and resentments, can fester without the antiseptic of clear articulation. This is not because she values relationship. It is because she values control. The unspoken cannot be refuted. The implied cannot be disproven. The hinted at cannot be defended against. This is why tyrants always prefer innuendo to indictment. The concept of invisible labor deserves particular contempt. Labor, in the economic sense, produces objective value: food built, shelter raised, wealth created, knowledge transmitted. The internal emotional management of a woman's fluctuating moods, the constant calibration of her feelings, the endless holding of relational space, these produce no civilizational surplus. They are shadow work, the management of internal chaos that should have been resolved in adolescence. To call this labor and to demand that a man pay for it with his attention, his presence, and his psychological health is a gynocentric racket of breathtaking audacity. It is the equivalent of a man demanding payment for the invisible labor of suppressing his impulse to violence when his boss insults him. We call that self-control. We used to call it maturity. Now we call it unpaid emotional work and bill it to the nearest man. The epistemological claim that truth emerges between people is the most dangerous sentence in the entire essay, and I do not make this observation lightly. This is an explicit denial of objective reality. It asserts that truth is not discovered but negotiated, not found but fashioned, not anchored in being but floating on the currents of relational dynamics. This is the epistemology of the solipsist, the philosophy of the child who believes the world disappears when she closes her eyes. The Western tradition, from the pre-Socratics through the scholastics to the empirical scientists, has always held that truth is the conformity of the mind to reality. The writer reverses this entirely. She makes reality conform to the mind, or rather to the consensus of minds, provided those minds are the right kind of minds housed in the right kind of bodies. This is not wisdom. It is the grammar of madness, dressed in academic robes and given a passing grade by committee. Consider what this epistemology means in practice. If truth emerges between people, then the person who refuses to participate in the emergence is guilty of killing truth itself. The man who leaves the conversation is not merely withdrawing from an argument. He is, within her framework, destroying the very possibility of knowledge. This is why she considers his exit unforgivable. She has constructed a metaphysical system in which his autonomy is an act of violence against reality. He cannot leave without becoming a destroyer of worlds. This is not philosophy. It is a hostage situation with footnotes. The concept of the boundary has been stolen and perverted. A boundary, properly understood, is an ontological fence, a line that separates order from chaos, the garden from the wilderness, the sovereign self from the invading other. When a man sets a boundary, when he says, "I will not participate in this conversation while I am being insulted," when he leaves a room that has become a tribunal, he is exercising the most basic defensive power of the autonomous agent. He is saying, "This far and no further. My presence is a gift, not an entitlement, and I revoke it when it is abused." The writer calls this retreat privileging because she cannot bear the implications. If a man's presence is a gift and not an entitlement, then she must earn it. If his departure is a right and not a crime, then she cannot control it. The entire essay is an elaborate attempt to revoke a man's right to say no. The weaponization of safety completes the trap. Safety, once meaning physical security from genuine harm, has expanded through concept creep to mean immunity from discomfort, then immunity from accountability. And finally, the right to demand another person's unlimited psychological presence, regardless of the cost to that person. When the writer demands that men stay at the table, stay in the conversation, stay present for whatever is about to be inflicted upon them, she is not requesting presence. She is demanding surrender. She is saying, "Sit still while I dissect you. "Do not move while I enumerate your sins, and if you leave, I will name your departure as violence and hold it against you forever." This is not the language of love. It is the language of the interrogator who tells the prisoner that cooperation will be easier if he simply confesses. The statistics tell a story the essayist does not wish to hear. Men account for roughly 80% of all suicides in the Western world. Men lose custody of their children in family courts over 80% of the time when cases are contested. Men comprise 93% of workplace fatalities. Men are the overwhelming majority of the homeless, the imprisoned, the substance addicted. These men did not retreat. These men stayed. They stayed at jobs that destroyed their bodies. They stayed in marriages that devoured their souls. They stayed in a society that taxed their labor to fund a welfare state that celebrates their obsolescence. And when they finally collapsed, when the weight became unbearable, when the last reserve of presence was spent, society did not mourn their absence. It did not even notice. There was no essay written about their withdrawal, no neologism coined to describe their pain. They simply disappeared quietly into the silence that the essayist claims does not exist. You want to know what happens when men stop retreating. When they stop leaving the table and instead flip it over, you get revolution. You get the chaos that always follows when the legitimate grievances of half the population are pathologized, silenced, and dismissed. The man who pushes back his chair and walks away is not your enemy. He is the last civilized man in the room, exercising the restraint that prevents something far worse. Be grateful he left quietly. The alternative is not more of his presence. The alternative is his permanent absence, and the kind of world that absence creates. I want you to consider what has just been taken from this man, not solely his evening, nor simply his calm, but the core presumption that a man holds the sovereign right to pull his focus away from a hostile actor. The creators of retreat privileging would have you think his departure was a display of patriarchal dominance. I argue that it was the last breath of due process in a household environment totally overtaken by the reasoning of the witch hunt. The underlying pathology hides not within the terminology, but in the anthropology beneath it, to force a man to stay seated across from an interrogator who has already found him guilty, to require him to yield his time as a toll for irrational grievance, to cast his retreat as evidence of guilt. This is not the design of a healthy partnership. It is the foundation for a specific form of bondage. And it appears exactly as modern tyrannies do, neatly disguised within the vocabulary of care. The abolition of due process, how presence as the minimum enslaves men to the feminine imperative. A man sits at a dinner table. Across from him sits a woman who has, for the 45 minutes preceding, reheated a catalogue of grievances so thoroughly debunked by observable reality that a medieval inquisitor would have blushed. She has accused him of emotional absence. She has accused him of instrumental rationality. She has accused him of failing to read, from the trembling timbre of her sigh, that she required him to intuit her desires without her having to articulate them like a functional adult. He places his fork down. He pushes back his chair. He leaves the room. According to the ideology of retreat privileging, he has just committed an act of violence. According to every sane civilization that has ever survived more than 2 generations, he has just exercised the most basic self-preservation instinct granted to any creature with a functioning nervous system. Let us define our terms before the ideologues steal them. Withdrawal, the act of removing oneself from a situation, relationship, or obligation. Violence, the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against another person that results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in harm. Notice that these definitions are not synonymous. Notice that conflating them requires an act of semantic terrorism, so audacious it would make Orwell's Ministry of Truth look like a parish newsletter. And yet here we are, watching an entire academic industrial apparatus insist that a man standing up from a table constitutes warfare, while a woman aborting his child without his consent constitutes healthcare. The asymmetry is not accidental. It is the entire point. The article before us demands what it calls presence as the minimum. Let us translate this from the feminine imperative's native tongue, passive-aggressive euphemism, into the language of reality. What is being demanded is the unconditional surrender of male autonomy to the emotional weather of a creature who has been legally, culturally, and institutionally shielded from the consequences of her own chaos. The man must sit, he must absorb, he must endure the hysteria, the indirect accusations, the solipsistic monologues disguised as relational epistemology. He must do this without defending himself, without clarifying facts, without appealing to logic, because logic itself has been recoded as domination. He must become in essence an emotional tampon with a mortgage. This is not a prescription for a healthy relationship between complementary souls. This is the model for a hostage situation with better interior design. Consider the breathtaking inversion at work. The same ideology that coined the phrase "my body, my choice" to defend a woman's absolute sovereign right to expel life from her womb now demands that a man has no sovereign right to expel himself from a dinner table. The same legal apparatus that enforces no-fault divorce, allowing women to unilaterally dissolve a marriage for any reason or none, taking the children, the house, and a third of the man's future income, now insists that a man quietly leaving a conversation is an unconscionable exercise of structural power. Women initiate approximately 70% of divorces. They receive primary custody in roughly 80% of contested cases. They are awarded child support and alimony at rates that would make a medieval tax collector weep with envy. And yet we are to believe that the true crisis of our age is that men occasionally push back from tables. The article's central assertion that disengagement is read as guilt, because it is guilt, deserves the kind of scrutiny its author has clearly never subjected her own premises to. Let us follow this logic to its inevitable terminus. If engagement is proof of oppressive dominance, the man who speaks is mansplaining, and disengagement is proof of guilty conscience, the man who leaves is retreating from accountability. Then the man is trapped in a Kafkaesque double bind from which no exoneration is possible. He is guilty if he speaks, he is guilty if he is silent, he is guilty if he stays, he is guilty if he goes. This is not the logic of justice, this is the logic of the witch trial, the show trial, the star chamber, every institution of ceremonial condemnation that the Western legal tradition spent 8 centuries dismantling, only to see it resurrected in the name of gender equity. The phrase due process comes to us from Magna Carta itself, Clause 39, which declared that no free man shall be punished except by the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. This principle, that accusation is not conviction, that the accused has the right to face his accuser, that evidence must outweigh emotion, was not a patriarchal conspiracy. It was the hard-won wisdom of civilizations that had seen what happens when accusation becomes proof. The Salem witch trials, the Spanish Inquisition, the Soviet purge trials. And what is being proposed here, under the antiseptic terminology of relational accountability, is precisely the abolition of that principle in the domestic sphere. The woman's feeling of harm constitutes the evidence. The man's denial constitutes the proof of guilt. The man's departure constitutes the confession. This is not jurisprudence. This is jurisprudence's corpse, dressed in a pantsuit and propped up in a witness stand. Now consider the article's claims about the suspicion heuristic. The assertion that female achievement is systematically met with doubt and diminishment. Let us examine the observable institutional reality. Universities maintain entire bureaucracies, diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, whose explicit purpose is to ensure that women and other designated groups receive preferential treatment in hiring, promotion, and retention. Corporations impose quota systems disguised as tapgets. Government contracts require percentage set-asides for female-owned businesses. The National Science Foundation, the NIH, and virtually every major granting agency have explicit programs favoring female applicants. And yet, we are asked to believe that the true victims of systemic suspicion are women whose work is contextualized in book reviews. The real extraction, the actual theft of earned prestige, is happening in the opposite direction. Competent men are being bypassed, their achievements dismissed as evidence of privilege, their merit recast as the mechanism of oppression. The man who spent a decade mastering his craft watches the position go to someone who spent that decade mastering the language of grievance, and he is told that his objection to this is retreat privileging. The article's invocation of the videographic proof, the paranoid fantasy that documentary editors are conspiring to cut away from women's most incisive moments, is perhaps the most revealing window into the psychology at work. Imagine constructing an entire theory of structural oppression from the observation that a film editor chose a nature shot instead of letting a talking head ramble past the point of viewer tolerance. This is not analysis. This is the hyper-vigilant scanning of a narcissistic personality structure that interprets every neutral event as a personal affront. The B-roll is not suppressing you. The editor is not silencing you. Sometimes a cut is just a cut. The inability to distinguish between aesthetic choices and systemic oppression is not evidence of sophistication. It is evidence of a mind so consumed by grievance that it has lost the capacity to distinguish reality from its own projections. What we are witnessing in this article is the mathematics of infantile demand elevated to civilizational principle. The woman says, "I'm fine, we can talk about it later," and this, we are told, is not passive aggression, but sophisticated relational epistemology. She expects the man to decode her refusal to communicate as a demand that he communicate on her behalf. She expects him to read her mind and then punishes him for failing to do so. And when he reasonably declines to participate in this telepathic farce, when he exercises the most minimal act of self-governance by leaving the room, she constructs an entire ideological superstructure to explain why his departure is not a rational response to her irrationality, but an act of warfare. This is not the behavior of an adult seeking partnership. This is the behavior of a child who has learned that tantrums are rewarded and that daddy's attention is an entitlement rather than a gift earned through reciprocity. The implicit anthropology of the article reveals everything. Women are credited with full agency when it serves the narrative. They are survivors, scholars, producers of knowledge. But the moment agency implies accountability, it vanishes. The woman who says, "I'm fine," when she is not fine is not responsible for the miscommunication. She is performing relational labor. The woman who makes an accusation is not required to provide evidence. The accusation is the evidence. The woman who drives a man from the room with her chaos is not responsible for his departure. His departure is proof of his guilt. Agency for me, passive victimhood for thee. This is not complementarity. This is parasitism with a philosophy degree. Consider the actual data on who is withdrawing from whom. Men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women. Boys are falling behind in every educational metric that matters. Literacy, graduation rates, university enrollment. Male labor force participation has been declining for decades. Men are withdrawing not from dinner tables, but from the entire civilizational project that has been restructured to demonize their very existence. And when they withdraw, when they go their own way, when they refuse to participate in institutions that hate them, the response is not reflection but frantic demands that they return and continue absorbing abuse. Stay, the article concludes, stay. This is the exposed throat of the feminine imperative. The terrified recognition that when men truly withdraw, when they stop building, protecting, providing, and propping up a system that rewards them with contempt, the whole parasitic edifice collapses. The Western tradition has always recognized the right of withdrawal as the final defense of the rational soul against tyranny. The Stoics taught that the sage could withdraw into his inner citadel when the external world became irrational. The medieval canonists taught that unjust laws imposed no obligation of obedience. The architects of the American Revolution declared that when a system becomes destructive of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the people may alter or abolish it. Withdrawal is not retreat. Withdrawal is the precondition of reconstruction. The man who leaves the corrupted table is not fleeing accountability. He is refusing to participate in his own destruction. And the system that calls this refusal violence has revealed, in that single word, that it knows exactly what it is doing. Every man who has sat through a human resources interrogation, disguised as a conversation about equity, knows this architecture. Every father who has watched a family court judge treat him as a wallet with legs, while his children are handed to the woman who destroyed the marriage, knows this architecture. Every young man who has sat in a university classroom and been told that his very existence constitutes an original sin of privilege knows this architecture. The demand for presence is never a demand for partnership. It is a demand for submission, and the man who submits to it does not earn gratitude. He earns only the contempt that every civilization has reserved for those who volunteer for their own enslavement. There is a higher duty than presence, and that duty is truth. The man who remains at a table where lies are served as sustenance is not virtuous, he is complicit in his own poisoning. The man who absorbs accusations without defense is not strong. He is a willing participant in a ritual of degradation designed to strip him of dignity, agency, and eventually sanity. The rational response to a system that defines your engagement as oppression and your withdrawal as guilt is not to engage more or withdraw more. It is to walk away entirely and build a new table where the laws of logic, evidence, and reciprocal obligations still hold. The masculine veto, the quiet, decisive departure of the competent man from the corrupted institution, is not a pathology. It is the last remaining check on a gynocentric order that would consume everything men have built and then complain that the meal was insufficiently seasoned. The old wisdom holds: you cannot reason with a mind that has declared reason its enemy. You cannot be present for someone who has defined your presence as violence. You cannot win a game where every move you make has been ruled a foul by a referee who is also the opposing team's coach. The only rational play is to leave the field and to take your ball with you. Let them play among themselves. Let them discover how long the infrastructure of civilization persists when the men who built and maintained it decide that the cost of participation exceeds the reward. The answer to stay is not negotiation. The answer to stay is the same answer every free man has given to every tyrant who has ever demanded his submission: no. Withholding the surplus of male competence from a system that calls his boundaries violence is not retreat. It is the beginning of reconquista. You now see the trap laid bare. The entire architecture of retreat privileging is a confession projected outward, a desperate plea to keep the host strapped to the table while the parasite feeds. She calls your exit violence because your absence is the one weapon she cannot twist into a guilty verdict. Consider what actually happens when a man stays in the modern relational calculus. He sits at a family court bench where mothers receive primary physical custody in over 80% of cases, often with no finding of paternal unfitness. He remains in a workplace where a single uncorroborated accusation can terminate his career while his accuser retains anonymity. He stays in a marriage where, upon its dissolution, 70% of divorces initiated by women, the primary reasons cited as dissatisfaction rather than abuse or betrayal, he will be extracted for alimony while she collects his children, his home, and the sympathy of every institution from the HR department to the family therapist who has already diagnosed his withdrawal as the root cause. The man who stays is not noble. He is a hostage who has developed affection for his captor. And yet the essayist writes, with the breathless urgency of someone who has just discovered the camera is still recording: stay. Stay while I recalibrate reality to ensure you can never be right. Stay while I refuse to articulate my grievances plainly so you can never defend yourself against them. Stay while I interpret your presence as domination and your absence as guilt, a double bind that would make a medieval inquisitor blush with professional envy. The Greeks had a word for someone who demands you remain present for your own destruction. They called him a tyrant. We have a different word today. We call her empowered. The numbers tell the story our institutions refuse to publish. Men comprise 93% of workplace fatalities. Men are 70% of the homeless. Men die by suicide at nearly 4 times the rate of women. And the apparatus of compassion publishes essays demanding that men sit still longer, listen harder, and absorb more emotional shrapnel from a culture that regards their suffering as statistical noise and their competence as original sin. Men are the only demographic in Western civilization that is a net lifetime contributor to the state that actively discriminates against them in education, hiring, criminal sentencing, where women receive 63% shorter sentences for identical offenses, and family law. And the feminist theoretician's response: you are not giving enough, you are not present enough. The vampire always complains the vein is running dry. You do not owe your presence to a system that pathologizes your strength, extracts your resources, and calls your self-preservation violence. You do not owe your attention to someone who refuses to tell you what she wants, so she can punish you for not knowing. You do not owe your silence to an ideology that has already convicted you of the crime of being born male. The entire essay we just vivisected is a love letter to a world where men have no exit, an instruction manual for a prison where the warden insists, with tears in her eyes, that the locked door is actually a boundary, and your desire to leave proves your guilt. Withholding the surplus of male competence from a system that calls your boundaries violence is not retreat. It is the beginning of Reconquista. You have seen the trap, now walk out of it. The table was never sacred, the meal was never free, and the person who built that table will be sitting alone for a very long time. And now the sponsored book, Introduction: Equality's Executioners, Feminist Jurisprudence, and the Death of Due Process. You've been lied to. I was too, until a judge looked me dead in the eye and said fatherhood is a privilege, not a right. That's when I realized the system wasn't broken. It was rigged. This book isn't theory, it's autopsy. We're dissecting the corpse of due process, killed by 150 years of feminist jurisprudence dressed up as progress. I've sat in family court watching men, good men, lose homes, kids and futures, while ex-wives smirked over alimony checks. I've tracked the money. Men pay 70% of taxes but get 0% of benefit of the doubt. I've seen boys branded toxic for playing tag, watched universities expel young men over unproven accusations, and witnessed the abortion lobby sell fetal parts while screaming, "My body, my choice." The pattern's clear. Feminism isn't equality, it's a shakedown. This book is for every man who's been called privileged while sleeping in his car after divorce, every father called a deadbeat for missing a child support payment after losing his job, every boy told his natural competitiveness is problematic. If you still believe men and women can be equal under a legal system that presumes male guilt and female sainthood, close this book now. Go binge Netflix. Collect stamps. Do anything except waste my time. For the rest of you, the unbroken, here's what you'll gain. Clarity. How Marxists hijacked Hegel's dialectic to turn family courts into wealth transfer machines. Proof. The 1 to 3% paternity fraud rate feminists pretend doesn't exist. Hint, that's 3 million cuckolded men in America alone. Strategy: fighting back against Title IX tribunals, restraining order abuse, and the IRS's war on single-earner households. Will expose the 20th century academics who rebranded envy as social justice, the judges who treat motherhood as sainthood and fatherhood as a parole condition, and the toxic masculinity scam that pathologizes male biology. Did you know 93% of workplace deaths are men? Feminists call that privilege. I call it a death cult. This isn't a debate, it's a counterattack. You'll either finish this book armed with facts to dismantle the gynocracy, or stay part of the problem. Choose wisely.
Equality's Executioners: Feminist Jurisprudence and the Death of Due Process, written by Sophie Marie Eve Riker. Buy now, links in description.